Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness echo through decades. Sometimes a simple bowl of soup can change two lives forever. 20 years ago, Cowboy Walker Hayes found a starving little girl lost on the plains. He gave her food and warmth, asking nothing in return. By morning, she was gone. Now old and alone on his ranch, Walker wonders if his life mattered at all. Then one day, thunder shakes the ground. 100 horses stop at his gate. Behind them stands the little girl, now a woman. She hasn't come to say thank you. She's brought something that will give his final years more meaning than he ever dreamed possible. But what could require 100 horses and 20 years of planning? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun crested the ridge behind Copper Creek Ranch, like it had every day for the past 37 years, casting long shadows across the weathered barn and fence posts that Walker Hayes had mended more times than he could count. As she 68, Walker moved with the deliberate care of a man whose body had absorbed decades of hard work, each step measured, each motion economical. His hands, gnarled as old oak roots, wrapped around the steaming coffee mug that had become as much a part of his morning ritual as checking the sky for weather. Rusty, his 13-year-old border collie, lifted his graying muzzle from the porch boards and offered a tail wag that spoke more of loyalty than energy. The dog had been Walker's constant companion since puppyhood, and now they were both feeling the weight of accumulated years. Walker scratched behind Rusty's ears, noting how the dog's hearing had dimmed and his joints had stiffened, mirror images of his own decline. "Another day, old friend," Walker murmured, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of a man who spent more time talking to animals than people. The ranch sprawled across 800 acres of Montana grassland, bordered by the Copper Creek that had given the property its name. Walker's great-grandfather had homesteaded this land in 1889, building the original cabin that still stood, though now it served as a storage shed. Walker's father had expanded the ranch, adding the main house and the large barn that dominated the center of the property. Now Walker maintained it alone, a task that grew more challenging with each passing season. He pulled his father's pocket watch from his vest, a habit that had persisted long after the timepiece had stopped working. The watch face showed 3:17, frozen there for the past 5 years, when the mainspring had finally given up. Walker had never bothered to have it repaired. Time seemed less important when you lived by the sun and the seasons rather than schedules and appointments. The watch had belonged to his father, Samuel Hayes, a man who had taught Walker that land was not something you owned, but something you stewarded. Samuel had died 15 years ago, leaving Walker to carry on traditions that felt increasingly distant from the modern world. Sometimes Walker wondered if he was the last of something, the last Hayes, the last of the old-style ranchers who knew every acre of their land intimately. He walked the familiar path to the barn, his boots stirring dust that hung in the still air. The building needed new shingles, and 2 of the stall doors hung crooked on their hinges. Walker had been meaning to fix them for months, but motivation came harder these days. What was the point of repairs when there was no one to inherit the improvements? Inside the barn, Walker's 3 remaining horses, Buck, a sturdy quarter horse, Sage, an aging mare, and Colt, the youngest at 12, greeted him with soft nickers. Once the barn had housed 15 horses. Once Walker had run cattle across these pastures and hired seasonal hands to help with the work. But cattle prices had dropped, expenses had risen, and Walker had gradually scaled back until only these 3 horses remained, kept more for companionship than practical purpose. As he distributed hay and checked water troughs, Walker's mind drifted to Cedar Falls, the small town 20 miles east, where he occasionally ventured for supplies. The townspeople knew him as a polite but distant figure, the hermit rancher who paid his bills on time and never caused trouble, but never lingered for conversation either. At Morrison's feed store, Clerk Jenny would ask about his health and the weather, and Walker would provide brief, courteous answers before loading his truck and driving home. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been invited to someone's home or shared a meal with another person. His social circle had dwindled to Rusty and the horses, and while their companionship was genuine, it couldn't fill the growing silence that seemed to expand with each passing year. Walker returned to the house, a modest two-story structure with a wraparound porch that his father had built in 1952. The kitchen still bore his mother's touches, floral curtains that she had sewn 40 years ago, a ceramic rooster collection that lined the windowsill, a worn wooden table where 3 generations of Hayes men had eaten their meals. Walker prepared a simple breakfast of eggs, bacon, and toast, eating methodically while reading yesterday's newspaper, the only connection to the outside world he maintained beyond his monthly trips to town. After breakfast, he settled into his father's recliner, his recliner now, and surveyed the living room that had changed little since his childhood. The same braided rug covered the hardwood floor. The same stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel displaying family photographs that chronicled the Hayes lineage. Walker's parents on their wedding day, his grandparents standing proudly. Beside their first truck, Walker himself as a young man in his army uniform, a photograph he rarely looked at directly. The silence of the house pressed around him like a physical presence, not the peaceful quiet of nature, but the hollow quiet of emptiness. Walker had grown accustomed to it, but lately the silence seemed to ask questions he couldn't answer. What legacy would he leave? Who would remember Walker Hayes after he was gone? Had his life mattered to anyone beyond himself? These thoughts came more frequently now, especially during the long winter evenings when darkness fell early and the wind howled across the empty pastures. Walker had never married, though there had been opportunities in his younger years. After his military service, he had returned to the ranch with plans to expand the operation, to build something worthy of the Hayes name. But somehow, the years had slipped past, first in the demanding work of rebuilding the ranch, then in the routine of maintaining it, and finally in the gradual acceptance that he would remain alone. He had no regrets about his choices exactly, but he sometimes wondered about the paths not taken. What would his father think of the ranch now, diminished and quiet? What would the great-grandfather, who had carved this place from raw wilderness, think of his descendant, the last Hayes, sitting alone in a house filled with memories and dust? Outside, the afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen window, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the golden light. Walker watched them for a long moment, thinking about how they moved without purpose or direction, suspended in space until they settled or were blown away. Sometimes he felt like one of those dust motes, drifting through his remaining years without clear purpose or destination. Rusty padded into the kitchen and rested his chin on Walker's knee, brown eyes holding the kind of understanding that passes between old friends. Walker stroked the dog's head, grateful for the contact, for the reminder that he was not entirely alone in the world. "What do you think, boy?" Walker asked softly. "Did we amount to anything worth remembering?" Rusty's tail thumped against the floor once, a gesture that Walker chose to interpret as reassurance, though he suspected the dog was simply responding to the sound of his voice. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose board on the porch that Walker kept meaning to nail down. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow he would fix that board, and maybe the stall doors, and perhaps even call someone about repairing the watch. But even as he made these silent promises, Walker knew tomorrow would likely bring the same quiet. Routine, the same gentle maintenance of a life that felt increasingly like preparation for an ending rather than purposeful living. The pocket watch remained still at 3:17, and Walker remained still in his chair, both of them marking time in their own broken ways. 20 years earlier, Walker Hayes had been a different man. At 48, his back was straighter, his hands steadier, and his heart less burdened by the weight of solitary years. He had been returning from a cattle drive to Billings, riding Buck's predecessor through the high country when the September storm caught him miles from shelter. The sky had darkened with frightening speed, transforming from clear blue to bruised purple in the span of minutes. Walker had hurried to set up camp in a sheltered grove of cottonwoods beside a seasonal creek, knowing that mountain storms could turn deadly without warning. As he built his fire and tethered his horse, the first fat raindrops began to fall, hissing against the hot stones he had arranged around the fire pit. Walker was stirring a pot of beans when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it beneath the growing rumble of thunder. A whimper. No, not quite a whimper. Something more human and infinitely more heartbreaking. He set down his spoon and listened, head cocked toward the darkness beyond his firelight. Lightning flickered, illuminating the landscape in stark black and white, and in that brief moment Walker saw her, a small figure huddled against a boulder 30 yards from his camp. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. What would a child be doing alone in this wilderness, miles from the nearest road? But when the next lightning flash came, there was no mistaking the small form pressed against the rock, trying to disappear into the stone itself. Walker approached, slowly, speaking in the same gentle tone he used with spooked horses. "Easy now, I'm not going to hurt you." She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, though dirt and fear made it hard to tell. Her clothes, a thin cotton dress, and worn sneakers, were completely inadequate for the mountain weather. Her dark hair was matted with mud and leaves, and when she looked up at him, Walker saw eyes that held far too much wariness for someone so young. "Are you lost, little one?" Walker kept his voice soft, non-threatening. He had no experience with children, but he understood frightened creatures. She didn't answer, just pressed herself harder against the boulder as rain began to fall in earnest. Walker realized she was shivering, not just from cold, but from fear and exhaustion that ran bone deep. "I've got a warm fire and some food," he said, settling into a crouch several feet away. "You don't have to say anything or do anything, just come get warm." For long minutes they stayed frozen in that tableau, Walker patient as stone, the girl watching him with the desperate calculation of a cornered animal. When thunder cracked overhead, she flinched violently, and Walker saw his opening. "That storm's going to get worse before it gets better," he said matter-of-factly, "and those shoes aren't going to keep your feet dry much longer." He stood slowly and walked back to his fire, not looking over his shoulder, giving her space to make her own choice. He ladled beans into a tin bowl, tore off a chunk of bread, and set both on a flat rock near the edge of his firelight. Then he retreated to the far side of the fire and busied himself with unnecessary tasks, checking his saddlebags, adjusting his bedroll, anything to avoid staring at her. When he finally glanced up, she had moved closer to the fire's warmth, though she still maintained the distance of someone ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Walker continued his careful non-attention, occasionally humming under his breath a tuneless melody his mother had sung when he was small. The bowl disappeared bite by bite, though he never saw her actually eating. When it was empty, Walker quietly refilled it and set it in the same spot. This bowl disappeared too, more quickly than the first. "Still hungry?" Walker asked without looking directly at her. No response, but he caught a slight nod in his peripheral vision. He opened a can of peaches, a luxury he had been saving for the end of his journey, and set it beside a fresh bowl of beans. Only, when she had finished everything, did Walker risk direct eye contact. "Better?" he asked. This time she nodded more clearly. Her shivering had stopped, and some of the wariness had left her eyes, replaced by exhaustion that seemed to weigh her small frame down. Walker retrieved a horse blanket from his pack, clean and thick, though it smelled faintly of leather and, "Hey!" He held it out to her, and after a moment's hesitation she took it, wrapping it around her shoulders like armor. "Got a name?" Walker asked gently. She shook her head, though whether that meant she didn't have a name or wouldn't share it, Walker couldn't tell. "Well, that's all right. Names aren't always the most important thing." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the dark sky. "I'm Walker. I've got a ranch about 40 miles south of here." The storm intensified, driving sheets of rain through the trees. Walker strung up a tarp to create a better shelter, and the girl moved into the protected space without being asked. She sat on his extra bedroll, clutching the blanket, watching his every movement with careful attention. As the night deepened, Walker found himself carving, a habit from his younger years that he had almost forgotten. His grandfather had taught him to whittle, and Walker's hands remembered the rhythm, even when his mind was occupied with other concerns. Tonight, he carved a small horse from a piece of pine, his knife moving in practiced strokes while he hummed that same tuneless melody. When he looked up, the girl was watching his hands with fascination rather than fear. Walker held up the half-finished carving. "A horse isn't quite done yet," he said, "but he's getting there." For the first time, she smiled, just a slight upturn of her lips, but it transformed her entire face. Walker felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He worked on the horse until his eyes grew heavy, occasionally glancing at the girl who sat perfectly still under her blanket. When he could no longer keep his eyes open, Walker settled into his bedroll on the opposite side of the fire. "Sleep tight, little one," he said softly. "You're safe here." Walker woke to grey dawn light and the sound of his horse nickering softly. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cool. He sat up, automatically looking toward where the girl had been sleeping. The bedroll was empty. Walker scrambled to his feet, searching the campsite with growing panic. The blanket was folded neatly where she had been sitting. Beside it lay a small piece of blue ribbon, the only evidence that she had ever existed. He spent the morning searching, calling out to the empty forest, following every possible trail. But she had vanished as completely as if she had been made of morning mist. Eventually, Walker gave up the search and broke camp, but the image of her haunted him for the rest of his journey home. In his saddlebags, he still carried the wooden horse he had been carving, now finished with careful attention to detail. He placed it on his mantle when he reached the ranch, alongside the blue ribbon, and for years afterward he wondered what had become of the mysterious little girl who had appeared and disappeared like a ghost in the storm. The ribbon faded over time, but Walker's memory of that night remained vivid. Sometimes he would dream about it, always waking with the same questions. Where had she come from? Where had she gone? Had he done enough to help her? The encounter had changed something fundamental in Walker, opening a part of his heart he hadn't. A known existed, creating a hollow space that never quite filled. Now 20 years later, standing at his kitchen window with his father's broken watch in his hand, Walker found himself thinking about that night more often. He wondered if the girl had survived, if she had found safety and love, if she even remembered the stranger who had shared his fire and food with no expectation of return. The carved horse still sat on his mantle alongside the faded blue ribbon. Artifacts of the most meaningful night of Walker's adult life. The sound that pulled Walker from his memories was unlike anything he had ever heard. A rhythmic thunder that seemed to rise from the earth itself. At first, he thought it might be a freight train, though the nearest tracks were 50 miles away. Then he considered military aircraft, but the sound was wrong for that too. Rusty lifted his head from the porch, ears pricked forward, a low whine escaping his throat. The dog's instincts were still sharp despite his age, and something in his posture told Walker this was no ordinary disturbance. Walker stepped outside, his hand automatically reaching for the porch rail as the ground beneath his feet seemed to vibrate. The sound grew louder, more defined, and suddenly Walker recognized it for what it was: hoofbeats. Not the hoofbeats of a few horses, but dozens, maybe more. He walked to the edge of his porch, squinting across the pasture toward the main gate. What he saw there defied comprehension. Horses. A sea of horses flowing across his land like a living river. Not the scattered handful he might expect from a neighboring ranch's loose stock, but a coordinated herd moving with purpose and precision. Walker counted quickly, 50, 70, 90, before giving up the attempt. There were at least 100 horses approaching his ranch, and they were magnificent. These weren't ordinary ranch horses. Walker had worked with horses his entire life, and he recognized quality when he saw it. These animals moved with the fluid grace of mustangs, their coats gleaming in the afternoon sun, their heads held high with the pride of creatures that had never truly been broken. They were wild horses, or as close to wild as still existed in the modern world. The herd came to a stop just outside Walker's gate, forming a rough semicircle that stretched across his front pasture. They stamped and snorted, but there was no chaos in their arrangement. Someone was controlling them, guiding them with an expertise that took Walker's breath away. From behind the largest stallion, a magnificent black with a white blaze down his face, a figure emerged on foot. Walker's eyes weren't what they used to be, but even at this distance, he could tell it was a woman. She moved among the horses with complete confidence, her hand touching a neck here, a shoulder there, maintaining the herd's cohesion through touch and presence alone. As she walked toward his gate, Walker felt something stir in his memory, something about the way she moved, purposeful but unhurried, reminded him of the woman stopped at his gate and looked directly at him across the intervening distance. Even from 50 yards away, Walker could see her dark hair and the confident set of her shoulders. She was tall and lean, dressed in practical riding clothes, but there was something indefinably familiar about her silhouette. Mr. Hayes, her voice carried clearly across the still air. Walker found himself walking toward the gate without conscious decision, Rusty limping along beside him. As the distance between them closed, the woman's features became clearer, and Walker felt his heart begin to race. It couldn't be. 20 years was a long time, and children changed completely as they grew into adults. But something about her eyes. "Do you remember me?" she asked when Walker reached the gate. Walker stared at her face, searching for traces of the terrified little girl he had helped so long ago. The bone structure was right, and those eyes, those same dark eyes that had watched him carve a wooden horse by firelight, the storm. Walker said, his voice barely above a whisper. 20 years ago. She smiled, and it was the same smile that had transformed her face when she was 7 years old. "My name is Aurora Blackstone. My friends call me Rory." Walker's hands shook as he fumbled with the gate latch. "I looked for you. The next morning I searched everywhere." "I know," Rory said gently. "I saw you looking. I was watching from the ridge above your camp. Why didn't you—" Walker stopped, realizing the question was foolish. A frightened child had her own reasons for hiding. "I wasn't ready to trust anyone completely," Rory explained. "Not yet, but what you did that night, the food, the warmth, the safety you gave me with no questions asked, it changed my life, Mr. Hayes." Walker finally got the gate open and stood aside as Rory entered his property. Up close, he could see the confidence that radiated from her, the way she carried herself like someone accustomed to being in charge. This was not the terrified waif from his memory. "What happened to you?" Walker asked. "After that night, where did you go?" "Back to the foster home I'd run away from," Rory said. "But this time I was different. I had proof that kindness existed in the world, that there were people who would help without expecting anything in return. It gave me hope." Walker glanced at the horses, still maintaining their formation in his pasture. "And these horses?" "My life's work," Rory said, following his gaze. "I became a wild horse advocate, Mr. Hayes. I rescue horses from situations where they're threatened, government roundups, private sales to slaughter buyers, situations where wild herds are endangered." Walker studied the herd with new understanding. These weren't just wild horses. They were rescued wild horses, animals that Rory had personally saved from death or captivity. "How did you find me?" Walker asked. "I never stopped looking for you," Rory said simply. "It took years to piece together the clues. A cowboy named Hayes, a ranch near Copper Creek, stories from old-timers in Cedar Falls about a quiet man who helped people but never talked about it. You have a reputation, Mr. Hayes. Even if you don't know it." Walker felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I don't have any kind of reputation. I'm just a rancher." "You're wrong about that," Rory said. "The Clearwater family still talks about how you helped them rebuild their barn after the fire in '98. Jenny Morrison says you've never missed paying your bills early, and you always ask about her daughter's college progress. Doc Patterson remembers when you drove him to Billings during that blizzard when his truck wouldn't start." Walker stared at her. These were just ordinary acts of decency, the kind of thing any neighbor would do. He had never thought of them as creating a reputation. "People notice kindness, Mr. Hayes," Rory continued, "especially in a world where it's becoming rare. You taught me that kindness matters, that it creates ripples that spread farther than we can imagine." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, not just any paper, but a detailed map marked with notations and colored symbols. "This is why I'm here," Rory said, unfolding the map. "This is why I brought the horses. I need your help, Mr. Hayes. Not just your kindness this time, but your voice, your reputation, your moral authority." Walker looked at the map, seeing locations marked across 3 states, notes about terrain and water sources, and symbols that clearly represented horse herds. "I don't understand," Walker said. "The last great wild horse sanctuary in the American West is about to be destroyed," Rory said, her voice carrying a weight of urgency that made Walker look up from the map. "And you're the only person who might be able to stop it." Walker invited Rory into his kitchen. The map spread across the same wooden table where 3 generations of Hayes men had made their plans and shared their meals. The corporate documents she placed beside the map seemed to transform his quiet home into a war room, papers bearing the letterhead of Meridian Corporation scattered across the worn surface. "Thunder Valley," Rory said, pointing to a shaded area on the map. 40,000 acres of pristine wilderness in the Pryor Mountains. It's been a sanctuary for wild horses for over a century, the last place in Montana where they can live completely free. Walker studied the map, recognizing the terrain from his younger days. He had ridden through that country during cattle drives, marveling at its untouched beauty. The valley was a natural fortress, surrounded by steep ridges and accessible only through narrow passes that kept vehicles out and predators manageable. "How many horses?" Walker asked. 312 as of last month's count, Rory said. 7 distinct family bands, some bloodlines going back to the Spanish conquistadors. It's not just a place, Mr. Hayes. It's a living piece of American history. Rory opened the corporate folder, revealing architectural drawings and development plans that made Walker's stomach turn. Meridian Corporation wants to turn Thunder Valley into a luxury resort and mining operation. They're calling it Thunder Ridge Wilderness Experience. 5-star accommodations, a championship golf course, and open-pit copper mining on the backside of the valley. The drawings showed buildings that would scar the landscape, roads carved through pristine wilderness, and mining equipment that would turn the sacred silence of the valley into an industrial wasteland. Walker could imagine the noise, the pollution, the transformation of a place that had remained unchanged for generations. "What about the Bureau of Land Management?" Walker asked. "They have to approve something like this. Meridian has been working the system for 3 years," Rory said bitterly. "Campaign contributions, lobbying, promises of jobs and tax revenue. They've convinced half the politicians that this is economic development, not environmental destruction." She pulled out another set of documents. Legal briefs, environmental impact studies, and court filings that represented 2 years of fighting. "We've tried everything. Lawsuits, public pressure campaigns, appeals to federal agencies. Every legal avenue has been blocked or delayed into meaninglessness." Walker felt overwhelmed by the scope of the opposition. "If lawyers and environmental groups can't stop this, what makes you think?" "Because they're fighting with facts and regulations," Rory interrupted. "But this isn't really about facts. It's about values. It's about what kind of people we want to be, what kind of world we want to leave behind." She leaned forward, her eyes holding the same intensity Walker remembered from that night by the fire. Meridian Corporation is counting on the fact that most people don't care about wild horses, that they'll accept the destruction of Thunder Valley if it means jobs and development. But they haven't counted on someone like you. Someone like me? Walker shook his head. I'm nobody special. I'm just an old rancher who lives alone with his dog. You're wrong, Rory said firmly. Do you know what Maria Clearwater calls you? The man who keeps the old promises. She says your word is better than any written contract, that when Walker Hayes says he'll do something, it gets done. Walker remembered Maria Clearwater, a Crow elder whose family had been neighbors to the Hayes Ranch for 4 generations. He had helped her family numerous times over the years, but never thought of it as anything remarkable. The environmental groups have credibility with people who already care about conservation, Rory continued. But you have credibility with people who care about character, about integrity, about the old values that built this country. She spread out newspaper clippings, printouts from websites, and photographs that documented Meridian Corporation's history. This isn't their first project, Mr. Hayes. They've destroyed wilderness areas in Colorado, Wyoming, and Nevada. They promise jobs and community development, but what they leave behind is environmental disaster and empty promises. Walker studied the photographs, open pit mines that looked like wounds in the earth, rivers poisoned by runoff, communities that had been promised prosperity but received only pollution and poverty. Why me specifically? Walker asked. Why not someone with political connections or media influence? Because those people can be dismissed as having ulterior motives, Rory said. Politicians want votes, activists want donations, corporations want profits. But you're different. You've never asked for anything from anyone. You've spent your life quietly doing the right thing, not because it benefited you, but because it was right. Rory reached into her jacket and pulled out a worn photograph. Walker recognized it as the picture that had run in the Cedar Falls newspaper 5 years ago, when he had helped rescue a family from a flash flood. He hadn't wanted the publicity, but the newspaper had run the story anyway. I've been following your life for 20 years, Rory admitted. Not stalking, but staying aware. Every act of kindness, every quiet gesture of help, I heard about them. You became my model for what a good person looks like. Walker felt embarrassed by her attention. I just did what anyone would do. No, Rory said. You did what everyone should do, but most people don't. There's a difference. She folded the map carefully, her movements precise and practiced. I need you to testify at the federal hearing. Next month, I need you to tell them what Thunder Valley means to people who understand the value of wild places and wild things. Walker stared at the corporate documents, feeling the weight of what she was asking. I've never spoken publicly about anything. I wouldn't know what to say. You'd say what you believe, Rory said simply. You'd speak for the horses who can't speak for themselves, for the land that can't defend itself, for the idea that some things are more important than profit. Walker walked to his kitchen window, looking out at Rory's horses still arranged in his pasture. They had settled into grazing, but their alertness remained, ears constantly moving, heads lifting to scan for danger. They were beautiful and powerful, but also vulnerable in a world that had little room left for wildness. What if I fail? Walker asked. What if my words don't matter? Then at least we'll know we tried, Rory said. And sometimes, Mr. Hayes, trying is all we can do. But I believe your words will matter. I believe they'll matter more than you think possible. Walker turned back to face her, seeing in her expression the same desperate hope he had seen in the little girl by his campfire 20 years ago. This time, she wasn't asking for soup and shelter. She was asking for something much harder to give. His voice, his reputation, his willingness to step outside the quiet life he had built and fight for something larger than himself. When is the hearing? Walker asked quietly. Rory's smile could have lit up his entire house. 3 weeks from today, in Denver. Walker nodded slowly, feeling something shift inside him, a door opening that had been closed for too long. Tell me what I need to do. 3 days later, Walker found himself in the passenger seat of Rory's weathered pickup truck, traveling roads he hadn't seen in years. The journey to Thunder Valley would take them through the heart of Montana's horse country, past ranches and wilderness areas that held decades of his memories. Rusty lay in the back seat, occasionally lifting his head to sample the wind through the cracked window. Walker had spent the previous evening packing supplies for what Rory called a reconnaissance mission, a chance for him to see Thunder Valley firsthand before committing to testify at the federal hearing. He'd also spent considerable time standing at his bathroom mirror, practicing what he might say to a room full of federal officials, lawyers, and environmental advocates. The words had sounded hollow and inadequate, leaving him more nervous. "About the journey ahead. Tell me about your life," Walker said as they drove through the rolling grasslands north of Cedar Falls. "After that night at my campfire, what happened to you?" Rory's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel, and Walker saw a shadow cross her face. The foster home wasn't a good place. The man who ran it, he had ideas about how children should be disciplined. Ideas that went beyond discipline. Walker felt anger flare in his chest. "He hurt you?" "He tried," Rory said quietly. "But after that night with you, I was different. I had learned that not all adults were dangerous, that some people actually kept their promises to help. It gave me hope, and hope made me stronger." She downshifted as they climbed a long hill, the truck's engine laboring against the grade. "I reported him to the authorities, and this time they listened. They moved me to a different home, with a family named the Clearwaters." Walker's eyebrows rose. "Maria Clearwater?" "Her nephew Robert and his wife Sarah," Rory confirmed. "They already had 3 children of their own, but they took me in anyway. They taught me about the connection between land and spirit, about responsibility to future generations. They also taught me to ride." As they crested the hill, the landscape opened into a vast panorama of grassland, punctuated by rocky outcroppings and distant mountains. Rory pulled the truck to the side of the road and pointed toward a cluster of buildings in the valley below. "The Clearwater Ranch," she said. "That's where I learned to work with horses, where I discovered my calling." Walker could see horses in the pastures, not the wild herd they were traveling with, but domestic animals that moved with the comfortable familiarity of home. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house, and Walker imagined the warmth and family life that had given Rory the foundation she needed to rebuild her shattered childhood. "They put me through college," Rory continued as they resumed driving. "University of Montana, animal science and environmental studies. I came back every summer to work on the ranch, and that's when I started encountering wild horse herds in the mountains." Walker listened as Rory described her evolution from college student to activist, her first rescue of an injured Mustang, her growing network of contacts in the wild horse protection community, her increasing expertise in managing and rehabilitating horses that had never known human kindness. "The horse that brought me to you that first day," Rory said, glancing in the rearview mirror at the distant herd that followed their truck like a loyal army. "His name is Thunder. I pulled him from a Bureau of Land Management roundup when he was just a yearling. The government was planning to sell him to a slaughter buyer." Walker turned to look back at the magnificent black stallion who led Rory's herd. Even at this distance, Thunder moved with the regal bearing of a king, his head high and alert as he kept pace with the vehicle that carried his human partner. "How many horses have you saved?" Walker asked. "Over the years, maybe 800, Rory said matter-of-factly. "Some I've rehabilitated and found homes for. Others, like Thunder and his band, stay with me. They're too wild for domestic life, but too bonded to humans to survive completely on their own." Walker tried to imagine the scope of such work. The physical demands, the emotional toll, the constant fundraising and advocacy required to maintain such an operation. "That's a life's work." "It's the only work that mattered to me," Rory said. "Every horse I saved was like paying forward the kindness you showed me that night. Every rescue was proof that individual actions can make a difference." They drove in, Companionable silence for several miles, the landscape gradually changing from grassland to foothills as they approached the Pryor Mountains. Walker found himself studying Rory's profile, seeing traces of the frightened child in the determined woman beside him. She had taken the foundation of hope he had unknowingly provided and built an entire life dedicated to protecting the vulnerable. "What about family?" Walker asked. "Marriage, children." Rory smiled, but it was touched with sadness. "I was engaged once, to a veterinarian who worked with wild horses. He understood my mission, even supported it. But ultimately, he wanted a different kind of life. A house in town, a predictable schedule, children and family dinners. I couldn't give up the horses, and he couldn't live with them always coming first." Walker understood that choice in ways that Rory probably didn't realize. He had made similar decisions throughout his life, choosing solitude and purpose over conventional family life. The difference was that Rory's solitude was filled with meaningful work and connection to the animals she protected, while his had gradually become empty routine. "Do you regret it?" Walker asked. "No," Rory said without hesitation. "I found my calling that night by your campfire, Mr. Hayes. Everything since then has been following that path." As they entered the foothills, the road became narrower and more winding. Walker could see their destination ahead, a wall of mountains that rose like ancient fortresses from the high plains. Somewhere beyond those peaks lay Thunder Valley, the last sanctuary that Rory was fighting to protect. "What will happen to your horses if we lose?" Walker asked. Rory was quiet for a long moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she navigated a particularly sharp curve. "I honestly don't know," she finally said. "There are other sanctuaries, but none with the space and isolation that Thunder Valley provides. Some of the horses might adapt to smaller preserves, but others, the ones who are truly wild, they need that freedom to survive." Walker looked back at Thunder and his herd, imagining them confined to small paddocks or, worse, shipped to slaughter buyers who saw them only as meat. The thought filled him with a rage he hadn't felt in years, a burning sense of injustice that demanded action. "We're not going to lose," Walker said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. Rory glanced at him, hope brightening her features. "I believe you, Mr. Hayes. I've believed in you for 20 years." Thunder Valley exceeded every expectation Walker had formed during the long drive through the mountains. As their truck crested the final ridge and the valley spread before them, Walker understood immediately why this place was worth fighting. The valley floor stretched for miles, covered in native grasses that rippled like water in the afternoon breeze. A clear stream meandered through the center, fed by springs that had run continuously for thousands of years. Ancient cottonwoods lined the water's course, their leaves golden with autumn's touch. But what took Walker's breath away were the horses. Wild horses moved across the valley floor in family groups, some grazing peacefully, while others played or rested in the shade of the cottonwoods. They were magnificent creatures, sleek, strong, and completely free. Their coats ranged from deep black to cream-colored palomino, with every shade of brown and gray between. These were horses as nature had intended them to be, unconstrained by fences or human expectations. "How long have horses lived here?" Walker asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Crow people say forever," replied a new voice behind them. Walker turned to see an elderly Native American woman climbing the ridge path, moving with the sure-footed grace of someone who had walked these mountains all her life. But the current herds trace back to horses that escaped from cavalry units and ranches in the 1800s. "Walker Hayes, meet Maria Clearwater," Rory said, her voice warm with affection and respect. "Maria, this is the man I've told you about, the one who helped me 20 years ago." Maria Clearwater was small in stature but carried herself with the dignity of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. Her silver hair was braided with leather and beads, and her dark eyes held the kind of wisdom that comes from living close to the land for 7 decades. She approached Walker with measured steps, studying his face with careful attention. "So you are the one," Maria said finally. "The keeper of promises." Walker felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I'm just Walker Hayes, ma'am. I'm pleased to meet you." Maria smiled, and Walker saw approval in her expression. "Humility is good. The earth has no use for big egos." She gestured toward the valley below. "Come, let me show you what we are fighting to protect." They descended into the valley along a narrow trail that Maria navigated with the confidence of long familiarity. Rory's horses had spread out to graze, integrating seamlessly with the wild herds that called Thunder Valley home. Walker noticed how the wild horses accepted the newcomers without aggression. These animals recognized their own kind, regardless of their recent history with humans. "My people have been connected to this valley for 8 generations, Maria explained, as they walked. "We consider ourselves guardians, not owners. The horses are part of that responsibility." She led them to a circle of stones near the creek, an ancient fire ring that spoke of countless gatherings and ceremonies. From her jacket, Maria produced a beautifully carved pipe, its bowl made of red stone, and its stem adorned with eagle, feathers, and small bells. "This pipe has been in my family for over a century," Maria said, settling onto a flat stone, with the ceremonial object cradled in her hands. "My great-grandfather carried it when he fought alongside Crazy Horse. My grandfather smoked it when he signed the treaty that was supposed to protect this valley forever." Walker examined the pipe with appropriate reverence, understanding that he was looking at a sacred object that connected Maria's family to generations of history and struggle. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every detail carved with patience and spiritual intention. "Treaties don't seem to mean much to corporations," Walker said quietly. "No," Maria agreed, "but they still mean something to people of honor. That's why we need your voice, Walker Hayes. Not because you have power or influence, but because you have something rarer, integrity that cannot be bought or corrupted." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the horses move across the valley floor. Walker noticed the family structures among the herds, dominant stallions protecting their mares and foals, young bachelor groups testing their strength against each other, elder horses moving with the patient wisdom of survivors. This was not just a collection of animals. This was a complete ecosystem, a community that had developed its own social order over generations. "What will happen to your people if the valley is developed?" Walker asked. Maria's expression darkened. "Our sacred sites will be destroyed. The burial grounds of our ancestors will be covered with golf courses and condominiums. The ceremonies we have conducted here for centuries will become impossible." She pointed toward a distant ridge where Walker could see what looked like stone formations. "Those are our vision quest sites, places where young people go to find their purpose and connection to the spirit world. Meridian Corporation's plans call for luxury cabins to be built there." Walker felt his anger building again. Not the hot, explosive anger of youth, but the cold, determined anger of a man who had seen too much injustice in his lifetime. "Have you told the federal officials about the cultural significance?" "Many times," Maria said with bitter humor. "They nod politely and promise to consider our concerns. Then they approve the projects anyway. They see dollar signs where we see sacred ground." Rory joined their conversation, settling beside Walker on the stone circle. "That's why we need someone like you to speak for us. Environmental arguments and cultural concerns can be dismissed as special interests. But when a man like Walker Hayes says something is worth protecting, people listen." Walker studied the valley again, trying to imagine it transformed by Meridian. Corporations' development plans, golf courses where native grasses now grew, mining equipment where horses now grazed, roads and buildings cutting through landscape that had remained unchanged for centuries. "I've been thinking about what I would say at the hearing," Walker said slowly, "about the value of wild places and wild things, but now I'm wondering if—" "That's enough." "What do you mean?" Rory asked. Walker picked up a handful of valley soil, letting it run through his fingers. "I mean, Maybe we need to do more than just testify. Maybe we need to show people what they're about to lose." Maria's eyes sharpened with interest. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about my father," Walker said, his mind racing with new possibilities. "He used to say that some fights are worth having even if you can't win them. But this fight, this one we can win. We just need to be smarter about how we fight it." He stood up, decision crystallizing in his mind. "We need to bring Thunder Valley to the hearing. We need to make those federal officials see what's really at stake." Rory and Maria exchanged glances, hope beginning to kindle in their expressions. "How do we do that?" Rory asked. Walker smiled for the first time since arriving at the valley. "We tell them a story they can't ignore. We show them that some things are more valuable than money, more important than development, more sacred than profit." As the sun set behind the western mountains, casting long shadows across Thunder Valley, Walker felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The discovery happened by accident, as most life-changing revelations do. Walker had returned to his ranch to gather documentation for the federal hearing, and Rory was helping him organize decades of land management records when she found the manila envelope wedged behind a filing cabinet drawer. The envelope was yellowed with age, bearing official seals and stamps that immediately caught her attention. "Mr. Hayes," Rory said, her voice carrying a strange note of excitement. "What are these?" Walker looked up from the stack of property deeds he had been sorting to see Rory holding military documents, forms he had hoped never to see again. His stomach clenched with old anxiety, as memories he had spent decades suppressing threatened to surface. "Those are my army records," Walker said quietly. "They're not important." But Rory was reading the documents with growing amazement, her eyes wide as she absorbed the information. "Walker, these say you were a ranger. You served in environmental protection units. You led missions to—" She stopped reading and stared at him. "You never told me you were a decorated war hero." "I'm not a hero," Walker said firmly. "I was a soldier who did his job and came home. That part of my life is over." Rory spread the documents across his kitchen table, revealing a service record that painted a picture of a man Walker barely recognized anymore. Commendations for valor, specialist training in environmental warfare, leadership of classified missions that had protected wilderness areas from illegal exploitation. The young soldier in these records seemed like a stranger to the aging rancher Walker had become. "Listen to this," Rory said, reading from an official citation. "Sergeant First Class Walker Hayes demonstrated exceptional leadership and expertise in Operation Green Shield, successfully preventing the illegal extraction of rare earth minerals from protected wilderness areas. His knowledge of land management and environmental protection protocols resulted in the preservation of over 50,000 acres of pristine habitat." Walker felt the weight of those memories settling on his shoulders like a heavy pack. That was a different time, a different man. "This is exactly what we need," Rory said, her excitement building. "You're not just a rancher with opinions about wild horses. You're a trained expert in environmental protection. You have credentials that nobody can dismiss or ignore." Walker walked to his kitchen window, looking out at the pasture where Rory's horses grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. Those animals trusted him now, accepted his presence because Rory had vouched for him. But the man described in those military records had seen things, done things that had cost him pieces of his soul he could never recover. "You don't understand," Walker said. "Those missions, they weren't just about protecting wilderness. They were about stopping people who would kill for profit, who would destroy anything that stood between them and money. I had to become something. I didn't want to be." Rory approached him carefully, sensing the pain in his voice. "What happened over there?" Walker was quiet for a long time, watching his horses move across the familiar landscape of his ranch. Finally, he began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. We were tracking illegal loggers in the Amazon, corporation-backed operations that were cutting down thousand-year-old trees to sell on the black market. My unit was supposed to document the destruction, gather evidence for international courts. But when we found their camp, Walker stopped, his hands gripping the windowsill. They had taken indigenous people as forced labor, men, women, children working in conditions that were basically slavery. The company was paying local warlords to provide workers and eliminate witnesses. Rory waited patiently, understanding that Walker was sharing something he had never told another person. I was supposed to radio for backup, wait for official authorization. But there were kids in that camp, Rory. Kids who reminded me of... He glanced at her, then looked away. I couldn't wait for permission to do the right thing. Walker's voice gained strength as he continued. We took out the operation, freed the workers, destroyed the equipment, captured evidence that eventually shut down the entire corporate network. But in the process, I had to become someone I didn't recognize. I had to do things that still wake me up at night. Rory studied his profile, beginning to understand the isolation he had chosen after his military service. That's why you came back to the ranch, why you've lived alone all these years. I needed to find my way back to who I was before the army, Walker said. I needed to prove to myself that I could choose kindness over violence, protection over destruction. And you did, Rory said softly. You've spent 40 years proving that every single day. Walker turned to face her, seeing in her eyes not judgment but understanding. The techniques I learned, the knowledge I gained, it came at a cost. I know how to fight corporations like Meridian, but fighting them requires becoming someone I've tried to leave behind. Rory picked up one of the commendations, reading it again. Walker, you spent your military career protecting wilderness areas from exactly the kind of exploitation that Meridian Corporation is planning. You know their tactics, their weaknesses, their methods. You're not just a witness at this hearing, you're the expert they need to hear from. Walker felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Part of him wanted to stuff the records back into their envelope and pretend Rory had never found them. But another part, the part that had responded to a frightened little girl 20 years ago, recognized the opportunity these documents represented. There's more, Walker said reluctantly. He walked to his bedroom and returned with a locked metal box that he placed on the kitchen table. Inside were photographs, maps, and documentation from his environmental protection missions, evidence of corporate crimes that had been classified for decades. Some of these companies still exist, Walker said, spreading the photographs across the table. Different names, same people, same methods. They destroy wilderness areas, exploit local populations, and disappear before anyone can hold them accountable. Rory examined the photographs with growing horror. Clear-cut forests that looked like bomb sites, poisoned rivers, communities displaced by corporate greed. But among the destruction were images of Walker's unit in action, young soldiers who had chosen to fight for protection rather than profit. You were heroes, Rory said. You were protecting things that couldn't protect themselves. We were soldiers following orders, Walker corrected. But yes, we believed in what we were doing. Rory looked up from the photographs, her eyes bright with new understanding. Don't you see? This is why you had to find me that night, why you had to help me become who I am today. This is why the horses brought me back to you. You have the knowledge and experience to stop Meridian Corporation, and I have the cause that can motivate you to use it. Walker studied his military records, seeing his younger self in the formal photographs and official descriptions. That man had been driven by duty and training, fighting corporate destruction with military precision. The question now was whether the older, wiser Walker Hayes could find a way to fight the same battle with the wisdom he had gained from decades of choosing peace over conflict. The hearing is in 10 days, Rory said. Will you use these records? Will you testify not just as a rancher, but as someone who understands exactly what Meridian Corporation represents? Walker picked up his father's broken pocket watch from the table, holding it for a moment before setting it aside. Time had stopped for him after the military, but maybe it was ready to start moving again. "Yes," Walker said, "but we do this my way. No violence, no military tactics. We fight them with truth, with law, with the kind of moral authority that comes from choosing to protect rather than destroy." Rory smiled, and in that smile Walker saw the same hope that had sustained her through 20 years of building a life, dedicated to helping others. "That's exactly the kind of fight we need," Rory said, "and exactly the kind of man we need to lead it." The federal courthouse in Denver buzzed with activity that reminded Walker of a military command center before a major operation. Lawyers wheeled cases full of documents through marble hallways. Journalists set up cameras and recording equipment, and activists from environmental groups coordinated their strategy in hushed conversations. Walker had never been comfortable in crowds, and the circus atmosphere of the federal hearing made his palms sweat and his heart race. "Remember," Rory said as they climbed the courthouse steps, "you're not just testifying for Thunder Valley. You're speaking for every wild place that's been threatened by corporate greed, every community that's been displaced by development, every future generation that deserves to inherit something more than shopping malls and mining pits." Walker adjusted his tie, a piece of clothing he hadn't worn in 5 years, and tried to calm his nerves. The wooden gavel that would determine Thunder Valley's fate waited somewhere beyond these courthouse doors in the hands of federal officials, who would weigh profit against preservation, development against conservation. In his jacket pocket, Walker carried his written testimony, handwritten notes that had taken him 3 sleepless nights to compose. The pages contained not just arguments about environmental protection, but personal reflections on the meaning of wildness, the value of freedom, and the responsibility each generation bears to protect what previous generations had preserved. "The media attention is incredible," said David Chen, the environmental lawyer who had been fighting Meridian Corporation for 2 years. CNN, NPR, even some international outlets. "Your story, the cowboy who helped a little girl and then fought to save wild horses 20 years later. It's captured people's imagination." Walker winced at the description. "I'm not comfortable being turned into some kind of folk hero." "That's exactly what makes you effective," Chen replied. "You're not seeking attention or personal gain. Your credibility comes from your reluctance to be here, not from any desire for spotlight." They entered the courthouse lobby, where Walker was surprised to see familiar faces from Cedar Falls. Jenny Morrison from the feed store waved from across the room. Doc Patterson nodded gravely from his seat near the information desk. Even Mayor Williams had made the drive to Denver, carrying a folder that Walker suspected contained letters of support from townspeople who barely knew him, but trusted his character. "Half the town came," Rory whispered in amazement. "They're here to support you." Walker felt simultaneously humbled and terrified by the responsibility these people had placed on his shoulders. They weren't just supporting his testimony, they were trusting him to represent values they all shared, but rarely had occasion to defend publicly. Maria Clearwater approached through the crowd, moving with the dignified bearing that commanded respect even in this unfamiliar urban environment. She carried a leather bundle that Walker recognized as containing her sacred pipe, the same ceremonial object she had shown him at Thunder Valley. "I wanted you to carry this with you when you testify," Maria said, offering Walker a small piece of carved bone tied with leather cord. "It's from the first horse my great-grandfather tamed in Thunder Valley, for strength and clear speech." Walker accepted the talisman with appropriate reverence, understanding that Maria was sharing something sacred from her family's history. The bone was smooth from generations of handling, warm from Maria's touch, and somehow comforting in a way that Walker couldn't explain. "Thank you," Walker said. "I'll honor the trust you're placing in me." "You already have," Maria replied. 20 years ago, when you helped a lost child without expecting anything in return. Today is just the continuation of that same kindness." As they made their way toward the hearing room, Walker noticed the opposition's preparation. Meridian Corporation had arrived with a team of lawyers in expensive suits, carrying briefcases that probably cost more than Walker's monthly ranch expenses. Their lead attorney, a sharp-faced woman with silver hair and calculating eyes, directed. A team with military precision. That's Catherine Vance, Chen whispered. She's one of the most effective corporate lawyers in the country. She's never lost a case involving environmental challenges to development projects. Walker studied Vance as she organized her legal team, noting the way she commanded attention and respect from everyone around her. This was a woman accustomed to winning, to overwhelming opposition with superior resources and legal expertise. What's her strategy likely to be? Walker asked. She'll try to make this about economics versus emotion, Chen explained. Jobs and development versus sentimental attachment to wild horses. She'll paint our side as unrealistic idealists who don't understand the practical needs of modern society. Walker nodded, understanding the battlefield better now. This wasn't just a legal hearing, it was a contest between different visions of America's future. On one side stood the corporate argument that progress required sacrifice, that economic development justified environmental destruction. On the other stood the belief that some things were more valuable than money, that future generations deserved to inherit beauty and wildness along with prosperity. The hearing room itself was smaller than Walker had expected, but packed with people representing every side of the controversy. Environmental activists sat beside ranchers who supported wild horse protection. Corporate executives occupied the front rows, their expensive suits a stark contrast to the working clothes worn by most of Walker's supporters. Journalists filled the back rows, cameras and recording equipment ready to capture every word. Walker took his assigned seat in the witness section, feeling the weight of attention from everyone in the room. Beside him, Rory squeezed his hand reassuringly, her presence a reminder of why he was here and what they were fighting to protect. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to Jenny Morrison from Cedar Falls, entered the courtroom with the bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. She was a middle-aged woman with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the crowded hearing room. This hearing will determine whether the Bureau of Land Management will approve Meridian Corporation's application to develop Thunder Valley for commercial and extractive purposes, Judge Morrison announced. Both sides will present evidence and testimony regarding the environmental, cultural, and economic impacts of the proposed development. Catherine Vance rose first, her opening statement delivered with the polished confidence of a seasoned courtroom performer. She spoke about job creation, economic development, and the practical needs of local communities. Her presentation included charts showing projected employment numbers, tax revenue calculations, and architectural renderings that made Meridian's resort development look like a tasteful addition to the landscape. The question before this court, Vance concluded, is whether the federal government will allow reasonable, responsible development that benefits actual human beings, or whether it will preserve wilderness for the sentimental enjoyment of a privileged few who can afford to visit but don't need to work. Walker listened to her arguments with growing anger, recognizing the same techniques he had encountered during his military service, the way corporate interests wrap destruction in the language of progress, making greed sound like public service. David Chen presented the environmental case with passion and detailed scientific evidence. He described the ecological importance of Thunder Valley, the genetic uniqueness of its wild horse populations, and the cultural significance of the area to local Native American communities. His arguments were factual and compelling, but Walker, you could see the glazed expressions on some faces in the audience, people who were overwhelmed by scientific data and environmental regulations. Now, Judge Morrison announced, we'll hear from individual witnesses, beginning with Mr. Walker Hayes. Walker, felt his heart hammering as he approached the witness stand, conscious of every eye in the courtroom focused on his movement. In his pocket, Maria's talisman felt warm against his fingers, a connection to the sacred responsibility he carried. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Words that carried special weight for a man who had spent his life trying to live by simple, honest principles. As Walker settled into the witness chair and looked out at the packed courtroom, he saw faces that represented every side of the controversy. Environmental activists leaned forward expectantly. Corporate executives watched with carefully neutral expressions. The people from Cedar Falls sat with the quiet confidence of neighbors who trusted their judgment of Walker's character. But it was Rory's face that steadied him, her eyes holding the same trust and hope she had shown as a frightened 7-year-old girl beside his campfire. She believed in him, believed that his words could make a difference, believed that the quiet rancher who had helped her 20 years ago could somehow save Thunder Valley from destruction. Judge Morrison looked at Walker expectantly. "Mr. Hayes, please state your full name and occupation for the record." Walker leaned toward the microphone, his voice steady despite the nervousness that threatened to overwhelm him. "My name is Walker Samuel Hayes. I'm a rancher from Copper Creek, Montana, and I'm here to tell you why Thunder Valley must be protected." In the audience, Rory smiled encouragingly, and Walker felt something shift inside him, the same certainty he had experienced that night 20 years ago when he decided to help a lost child. No questions asked. This was right. This was necessary. This was what his life had been preparing him for. Walker looked out at the packed courtroom and felt the weight of his father's broken pocket watch in his vest. A reminder that some things endure beyond their apparent usefulness, that value isn't always measured by function or profit. He pulled out his handwritten notes, pages that contained not just legal arguments, but the distilled wisdom of a man who had spent 68 years learning the difference between what costs money and what costs your soul. The microphone crackled slightly as Walker adjusted it, and in that moment of mechanical feedback, he heard an echo of every machine that had ever torn into pristine wilderness, every bulldozer that had carved roads through sacred ground, every drill that had pierced the earth in search of profit beneath beauty. 20 years ago, Walker began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, I found a little girl lost in a storm. She was hungry, scared, and alone in wilderness that could have killed her before morning. I gave her food and shelter, not because I expected anything in return, but because it was the right thing to do. Walker paused, letting his eyes sweep across the faces before him. Lawyers calculating legal angles, journalists scribbling notes, environmental activists leaning forward with hope, corporate executives maintaining carefully neutral expressions. But it was the faces from Cedar Falls that steadied him. Jenny Morrison, with her work-worn hands folded in prayer, Doc Patterson nodding encouragement, neighbors who had driven 5 hours to support a man they respected but barely knew. That little girl was dying, Walker continued, his voice growing stronger, not just from hunger and cold, but from the kind of despair that kills the spirit before it kills the body. She had run away from people who were supposed to protect her into wilderness that was indifferent to her survival. Walker glanced at Rory, who sat in the front row with tears already gathering in her eyes. That little girl grew up to become Aurora Blackstone, one of the finest wild horse advocates in the American West. She came back to me 3 weeks ago, not to say thank you, but to ask for my help in protecting the last great wild horse sanctuary. In Montana, Judge Morrison leaned forward slightly, her attention clearly engaged by Walker's personal approach to testimony that had thus far been dominated by technical arguments and legal precedents. Your Honor, I need to tell you something. About that night 20 years ago, Walker said, his voice taking on the cadence of a man sharing a confession. When I found that child, my first instinct wasn't kindness. My first instinct was inconvenience. I was tired, cold, and eager to reach shelter before the storm worsened. Helping her would delay my journey, complicate my plans, possibly put me in danger if she was running from something serious. Several people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing their own moments of moral hesitation in Walker's honesty. But something my father taught me when I was young came back to me in that moment. Walker continued. He said that the measure of a man's character isn't what he does when it's easy or profitable, but what he does when it costs him something he'd rather keep. Walker looked directly at Catherine Vance, Meridian Corporation's lead attorney, seeing in her sharp features the same calculation he had recognized in corporate executives around the world, the ability to reduce human and environmental costs to acceptable losses on a profit spreadsheet. Your Honor, I'm not a lawyer or a scientist or a politician, Walker continued. I'm a rancher whose family has worked the same land for 4 generations. I understand the value of hard work, the necessity of making a living, and the importance of economic development to rural communities. He gestured toward the Meridian Corporation team. These people aren't wrong when they talk about the economic benefits of development. Jobs will be created, at least temporarily. Tax revenue will be generated, at least initially. Local businesses will see increased activity, at least for a while. Catherine Vance shifted in her seat, clearly uncertain where Walker's testimony was heading. But I also understand something that doesn't show up in corporate profit projections, Walker said, his voice gaining the authority that came from hard-earned experience. I understand that some things, once lost, can never be recovered. Some places, once destroyed, can never be rebuilt. Some freedoms, once surrendered, can never be reclaimed. Walker set down his notes and spoke directly from his heart, his hands gesturing naturally as he found his rhythm. Thunder Valley isn't just a piece of real estate waiting to be developed. It's a living sanctuary where wild horses have run free. For over a century, these aren't decorative animals put there for our entertainment. They're survivors, descendants of horses that chose freedom over safety, wildness over comfort. He pulled Maria's talisman from his pocket, holding the carved bone, so everyone in the courtroom could see this simple artifact that connected past to present. This piece of bone came from the first horse that Maria Clearwater's great-grandfather gentled in Thunder Valley over 100 years ago. It represents a connection between people and horses, between past and present, between the choices we make today and the legacy we leave for our children. Walker's voice carried a conviction that seemed to fill every corner of the courtroom. Meridian Corporation wants you to believe that this hearing is about jobs versus horses, practical economics versus sentimental environmentalism. But that's not what this is about. This is about what kind of people we choose to be when we think no one is watching, when the only accountability is to our own conscience. Several audience members nodded unconsciously, drawn into Walker's narrative, despite any preconceptions they might have held about environmental testimony. Even some of the corporate executives were listening with reluctant attention, perhaps hearing moral challenges they had trained themselves to ignore. I served in the United States Army for 12 years, Walker continued, his military records giving weight to every word. I led environmental protection missions in some of the most remote wilderness areas in the world. I've seen what happens when corporations like Meridian get their way: forests stripped bare, rivers poisoned by mining runoff, indigenous communities displaced from ancestral lands, and local people left with nothing but contaminated soil and broken promises of prosperity. Catherine Vance rose to object, but Judge Morrison waved her back down with evident interest. I'll allow this testimony to continue. The documents in my military file show mission after mission where my unit had to stop illegal corporate exploitation of protected lands, Walker said, his voice taking on the precise cadence of a soldier delivering a briefing. The same patterns repeated in every case: Promises of local economic benefit, assurances of environmental responsibility, guarantees of community consultation, and the same devastating results every time. Walker pulled out one of the photographs from his military service, holding it so the courtroom could see the image of a devastated landscape. This was a pristine watershed in Peru before Meridian Corporation's predecessor began copper mining operations. The company promised jobs, infrastructure development, and environmental protection. What they delivered was this: poisoned water that killed livestock for 50 miles downstream, unemployment when the easily accessible ore ran out, and environmental destruction that will take centuries to heal. The photograph was passed to Judge Morrison, who studied it with growing concern. The image showed what had once been a lush valley transformed into a moonscape of exposed earth and polluted water. Meridian Corporation isn't bringing prosperity to Montana, Walker said, his voice carrying the weight of witnessed truth. They're bringing the same destruction they've brought to wilderness areas in Colorado, Wyoming, Nevada, New Mexico, and a dozen countries around the world. The only difference is that this time they're targeting the last place in America where wild horses can live as nature intended them to live. Walker's testimony was building momentum, his quiet authority commanding attention from every person in the courtroom. Even Meridian's executives were listening intently, perhaps recognizing in Walker's words a moral challenge they hadn't expected to face from a simple rancher. Walker reached into his jacket and pulled out the faded blue ribbon, the same ribbon the little girl had left behind 20 years ago. He held it up so everyone in the courtroom could see this simple piece of fabric that had connected his past to his present, that had brought him to this moment of moral reckoning. The ribbon was small and worn, but in the courtroom's bright lights, it seemed to carry the weight of every promise ever made and kept, every act of kindness passed forward through generations. This ribbon was left behind by that scared little girl, Walker said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom with the authority of absolute truth. For 20 years I kept it on my mantle, wondering if I had done enough to help her. I would look at it every morning when I drank my coffee, every evening when I checked the doors before bed. It became a question that haunted my solitude. Had my life mattered to anyone beyond myself? Walker's hands were steady as he pinned the ribbon to his jacket lapel, a visible symbol of the connection between personal kindness and public responsibility. Now I know the answer. What I did that night wasn't enough by itself. It was just the beginning. That little girl became a woman who has dedicated her life to protecting creatures who can't protect themselves. She taught me that individual acts of kindness create ripples that spread farther than we can imagine, that the soup and blanket I shared 20 years ago somehow led to this courtroom, this moment, this chance to save Thunder Valley. Walker looked directly at the Meridian Corporation executives, his gaze steady and uncompromising. Several of them shifted uncomfortably under his scrutiny, perhaps feeling for the first time the moral weight of their corporate decisions. But kindness isn't enough when it faces organized greed, Walker continued, his voice gaining power. Protection isn't enough when it confronts systematic destruction. Sometimes good people have to stand up and fight for what they believe in, even when fighting is the last thing they want to do. Judge Morrison was watching Walker with obvious fascination, clearly moved by his personal testimony in ways that technical arguments and legal precedents hadn't achieved. Her legal training had prepared her to weigh evidence and interpret regulations, but Walker's moral authority was challenging her to consider questions that couldn't be answered by reference to statute books. "Your Honor," Walker said, turning his full attention to the judge, "my military records show that I spent 12 years fighting to protect wilderness areas from exactly the kind of exploitation that Meridian Corporation is proposing for Thunder Valley. I know their methods because I've seen them used in rainforests and mountains, in deserts and wetlands, on every continent where profit can be extracted from natural beauty. He pulled out more photographs from his environmental protection missions, images that showed the devastating aftermath of corporate wilderness development in stark, undeniable detail. This is what Meridian's responsible development looks like after they've taken their profits and moved on to the next project. This is what they mean when they promise to minimize environmental impact and respect local communities. The photographs were passed to Judge Morrison, who examined them with growing concern and visible anger. Images of strip-mined landscapes that looked like bomb craters, rivers running red with mining chemicals, communities of displaced families living in refugee camps, while corporate executives celebrated record quarterly profits. These aren't isolated incidents, Walker said, his voice cutting through the courtroom's silence like a sword through fabric. These are the inevitable results of Meridian Corporation's business model. They identify beautiful, vulnerable landscapes. They promise local economic development to gain political support. They extract maximum profit in minimum time. Then they declare bankruptcy, reorganize under a new corporate name, and repeat the process somewhere else. Catherine Vance finally rose to object, her composure cracking under the weight of Walker's accusations. Your Honor, Mr. Hayes is making unfounded accusations against my client based on unrelated projects. Are they unrelated? Walker interrupted, his voice sharp with controlled anger that had been building for decades. Because my investigation shows that Meridian Corporation has used the identical development model in Colorado, Wyoming, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. Same promises, same techniques, same devastating results. The only difference is the names they use: Meridian in Montana, Rocky Mountain Development in Colorado, Desert Sun Corporation in Nevada. Walker pulled out a folder containing corporate documents that showed the interconnected web of companies that operated under Meridian's umbrella. These are all the same people, Your Honor. The same executives, the same investors, the same board of directors moving from state to state, country to country, leaving environmental destruction in their wake like a plague. Judge Morrison held up her hand to silence both attorneys, her attention completely focused on Walker's testimony. Mr. Hayes, please continue. Walker felt the momentum building, sensing that he was reaching people in ways that legal arguments alone could never achieve. The courtroom had become a forum for moral reckoning, not just legal interpretation. The question before this court isn't whether Thunder Valley can be developed profitably. Of course it can, Walker said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. Any beautiful place can be destroyed for money. Any wild landscape can be converted into golf courses and condominiums and mining pits. The question is whether we're the kind of people who will sacrifice the last wild sanctuary in Montana for corporate profit. He looked out at the audience, seeing faces that reflected the moral struggle at the heart of this hearing. Some people were nodding in agreement. Others were clearly wrestling with the implications of his testimony. Even some of Meridian's supporters seemed to be reconsidering their positions. Some of you probably think I'm being sentimental, Walker continued, his voice carrying a note of gentle understanding. You might believe that I'm putting horses ahead of human needs, that I'm an old man who doesn't understand the economic realities of the modern world. Walker smiled slightly, the expression transforming his weathered features. But that's not what this is about. This is about what makes us human in the first place. This is about the capacity we have, unique among all species on Earth, to protect something beautiful, even when it costs us money. His voice gained power as he reached the climax of his testimony, every word carrying the conviction of a man who had found his purpose. We are the only creatures capable of preserving wildness for future generations, even when it would be easier and more profitable to destroy it for immediate gain. We are the only species that can choose to protect the vulnerable instead of exploiting them. The courtroom was absolutely silent, every person absorbed in Walker's words. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, caught up in the moment's moral intensity. 20 years ago, I helped one lost child because it was the right thing to do, Walker said, his voice filled with the conviction that comes from absolute moral certainty. I didn't think about cost or convenience or personal benefit. I saw someone who needed help, and I helped her. Today, I'm asking you to help 300 wild horses for the same reason. Not because it's profitable, not because it's easy, but because it's right. Walker looked directly at Judge Morrison, his eyes holding the moral authority that came from a lifetime of choosing integrity over convenience, kindness over indifference, protection over profit. Your Honor, if we allow Thunder Valley to be destroyed, we're not just killing wild horses and desecrating sacred land. We're killing something inside ourselves, the part that believes some things are more important than money, the part that protects the vulnerable instead of exploiting them, the part that preserves beauty for future generations instead of consuming it for immediate gratification. He held up the blue ribbon one final time, its faded color somehow more vibrant in the courtroom's harsh, fluorescent lighting. This little piece of fabric represents the connection between past kindness and future responsibility. It represents the choice between being people who protect and people who destroy, between being people who pass kindness forward and people who break the chain of compassion that connects generation to generation. Walker's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing everyone in the courtroom to lean forward to hear his final words. The silence was so complete that the sound of his breathing seemed amplified. I gave that little girl a bowl of soup, and I asked for nothing in return, Walker said, each word chosen with the precision of a man who understood that words could change the world. Today, she's asking me to help save Thunder Valley and its wild horses. I'm here because some debts of kindness can only be repaid by passing kindness forward, because some promises are made not with words, but with actions, because some responsibilities we inherit not through law, but through love. He looked out at the packed courtroom one final time, his gaze encompassing everyone from environmental activists to corporate executives, from local ranchers to federal officials. The question before you isn't whether we can afford to protect Thunder Valley. The question is whether we can afford not to. The question isn't whether wild horses deserve our protection. The question is whether we deserve to call ourselves protectors of the innocent and guardians of the beautiful. Walker stepped down from the witness stand, the blue ribbon still pinned to his jacket like a medal of honor earned through decades of quiet service to others. As he returned to his seat beside Rory, who was crying openly with pride and hope, the courtroom remained silent for several heartbeats, as if everyone present was absorbing the moral challenge he had laid before them. Judge Morrison sat motionless for a long moment, clearly moved by testimony that had transcended legal argument to become something approaching a spiritual calling to conscience. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested Walker's words had found their mark. This court will recess for deliberation, Judge Morrison announced. We will reconvene at 2 o'clock for our decision. As people began filing out of the courtroom, many stopped to shake Walker's hand or simply nod in respect. Even some of Meridian Corporation's supporters seemed subdued, perhaps realizing for the first time that they were supporting more than just economic development. They were supporting the destruction of something irreplaceable and sacred. Walker sat quietly beside Rory, the blue ribbon still pinned to his jacket, knowing that he had spoken every true word in his heart. Whatever the decision, he had honored the promise he had made to a frightened little girl 20 years ago, and he had honored the responsibility that Maria Clearwater had placed in his hands. 6 months after the federal hearing, Walker Hayes stood beside a newly painted ranch sign that read, Hayes Blackstone Wild Horse Sanctuary. The morning sun cast long shadows across his property, but these shadows now fell on land that pulsed with new purpose and meaning. Where once Walker had maintained empty pastures for 3 aging horses, he now oversaw a rehabilitation center that housed 24 rescued Mustangs and served as a training ground for the next generation of wild horse advocates. The federal judges had ruled unanimously in favor of protecting Thunder Valley, but their decision had done more than save 300 wild horses from displacement. Judge Morrison's written opinion had established new legal precedents for weighing cultural and environmental values against corporate development, citing Walker's testimony as a perfect example of how individual moral authority could illuminate broader social responsibilities. Meridian Corporation's appeal had failed spectacularly when additional evidence surfaced about their previous environmental crimes, evidence that Walker's military contacts had helped uncover through careful investigation of corporate records. Catherine Vance's reputation for never losing environmental cases was now permanently tarnished, and Meridian's stock price had dropped significantly as investors realized the company's business model was built on exploitation that could no longer operate in secrecy. The morning count shows all 24 horses healthy and accounted for, Rory reported as she approached Walker's position by the ranch sign. She had moved her base of operations to a cabin on Walker's property, creating a partnership that combined his land management expertise with her wild horse knowledge. Thunder, the magnificent black stallion who had led Rory's herd to Walker's gate, now served as the patriarch of the sanctuary's resident population. The horse had adapted to his new role with regal dignity, accepting the presence of visitors and volunteers, while maintaining the wild dignity that made him a perfect ambassador for his species. "Any word from the university about the summer internship program?" Walker asked. Dr. Martinez confirmed 12 students for the wildlife management practicum, Rory said, consulting her ever-present notebook. "They'll arrive next week for a 6-week intensive course in wild horse behavior, rehabilitation techniques, and habitat preservation." Walker smiled, thinking about how different his ranch would be with 12 young people eager to learn about conservation. The quiet isolation that had defined his life for so many years had been replaced by purposeful activity that gave every day new meaning. The transformation hadn't been easy. Converting his ranch into a sanctuary had required significant infrastructure improvements, new fencing designed to contain wild horses without breaking their spirits, and veterinary facilities capable of handling animals that had never experienced human medical care. But Walker's military pension, combined with donations that poured in after media coverage of the federal hearing, had provided the necessary funding. More importantly, the work had given Walker's final years the kind of meaning he had thought lost forever. Instead of maintaining empty buildings and unused pastures, he now spent his days teaching young people about land stewardship, horse behavior, and the delicate balance between wildness and domestication. "Maria called this morning," Rory said. "The Crow Nation is planning a ceremony next month to formally recognize Thunder Valley as a protected cultural site. They want you to be there." Walker felt honored by the invitation. His relationship with Maria Clearwater had deepened into genuine friendship based on shared values and mutual respect. She often visited the sanctuary, teaching volunteers about the spiritual connection between horses and land, sharing stories that linked present conservation efforts to ancient traditions of environmental stewardship. Rusty, now 14 and moving, slowly but still alert, lifted his head from his favorite spot on the porch and wagged his tail as a familiar pickup truck approached. Walker recognized the vehicle as belonging to Doc Patterson, who had become a regular visitor since the federal hearing made Walker something of a local celebrity. "Morning, Walker," Doc Patterson called as he climbed out of his truck. "Brought someone to meet you." Behind Doc Patterson, a young girl emerged from the passenger seat, perhaps 8 years old, with dark hair and eyes that held the same wariness Walker remembered from another child 20 years ago. She stayed close to Doc Patterson's side, clearly uncomfortable in this unfamiliar place. "This is Emma," Doc Patterson explained. She's been staying with the Hendersons since the state removed her from an unsafe situation. She hasn't spoken much since they brought her in, but yesterday she saw a news story about your sanctuary and asked if she could see the horses. Walker approached slowly, using the same gentle technique he had employed with frightened horses and lost children. "Hello, Emma. I'm Walker. Would you like to meet some of our horses?" Emma nodded shyly, her interest overcoming her caution. Walker led her to the pasture fence, where several of the gentler horses grazed peacefully. Thunder approached with stately dignity, lowering his massive head so Emma could see him clearly. "He's beautiful," Emma whispered, the first words she had spoken in front of Walker. "He used to be wild," Walker said, "but he learned that some people can be trusted. Sometimes that takes time." Emma reached through the fence rails to touch Thunder's soft nose, her face lighting up with wonder as the great horse accepted her gentle touch. Walker saw in that moment the same transformation he had witnessed in himself, the way kindness creates connection, how trust builds gradually through patient attention. As Emma petted Thunder with growing confidence, Walker felt the circle completing itself. 20 years ago he had helped a lost child who grew up to save wild horses. Now those horses were helping another lost child find her way back to trust and hope. The blue ribbon he still kept framed in the sanctuary's visitor center had become the symbol of an endless cycle of kindness, each act creating possibilities for future compassion. "Would you like to help me feed the horses tomorrow?" Walker asked Emma. She nodded eagerly, her transformation already beginning. Walker smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring not just another day of ranch work, but another opportunity to prove that individual kindness could create ripples that spread farther than anyone might imagine. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the land that now served a purpose larger than profit, and Walker Hayes finally understood that his life had mattered more than he had ever dared to hope.